She walked into the forgotten kitchen, and she did not cry. The roof had a hole in it, the stove was black with rust. The shelves held nothing but years of dust and the particular silence of a place everyone had given up on. Matthew Walker stood in the doorway behind her, waiting for the disappointment he'd seen on every face before hers. Anna Bennett set down her bag, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. He had given her the one place on his ranch that nobody wanted. He did not yet understand that she was exactly the kind of woman who looked at abandoned things and saw everything they could still become. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get back to Anna because she's about to do something nobody on this ranch expected. The kitchen smelled like something had died in it. Not recently, not dramatically. Just slowly, the way things die when nobody pays attention, a gradual surrender to dust and rust, and the particular kind of silence that settles into a room when it has been abandoned long enough to forget what it was built for. Anna Bennett stood in the doorway and took it all in. Cracked window glass, a stove black with corrosion, shelves that sagged under the weight of nothing but air and old grease. A ceiling beam split down the middle, mouse droppings along the baseboard. A tin bucket on the floor, catching water from a hole in the roof nobody had bothered to patch. This was what Matthew Walker had offered her. This was her position. She turned around. Matthew was already walking away, his boots crossing the hard-packed earth between the kitchen building and the main barn. His broad shoulders set in that particular way men carry themselves when they have already decided the conversation is finished. Mr. Walker. He stopped, did not turn around. Is this the entire position? Anna asked. Or is there something else you forgot to mention? He turned then. His eyes were pale gray in the late afternoon light, and they held the expression of a man who had stopped being surprised by disappointment a long time ago. You wanted work, he said. That's the work. The stove is rusted through. Yes, the roof leaks, I know. There's no food stored anywhere that I can see. That's correct. Anna looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the kitchen, then back at him. And you expect me to cook for how many men? 12 ranch hands. Sometimes more during cattle drives, from this. It wasn't a question, it was a statement she made to the air between them, quiet and even, the way a woman states a fact she is still deciding what to do with. Matthew Walker's jaw tightened. If the position doesn't suit you, Miss Bennett, I can arrange your return to Billings in the morning. There's no obligation. I didn't say it didn't suit me. You've said very little of anything reassuring. Anna set her bag down on the single wooden chair that hadn't rotted through. The chair wobbled. She steadied it with one hand, and then released it carefully, as if she were giving it a chance to prove itself. Mr. Walker, she said, I left everything I had behind me. My farm is gone. My savings are nearly gone. I answered your advertisement because it said you needed someone capable of managing household work and rebuilding operations. She paused. This kitchen needs both. I'm capable of both. So unless you're telling me you've changed your mind about needing either one, I'd suggest you let me get to work. The silence stretched between them. A horse in the distant barn shifted and knocked against its stall. Wind moved across the valley and pushed through the cracked kitchen window with a low moan. Matthew Walker looked at Anna Bennett the way a man looks at something he cannot quite categorize, not with hostility, not with welcome, but with a narrow and cautious attention. Like she was a weather system moving in from the west, and he couldn't yet tell what she was bringing with her. Supper is expected at 6, he said, and he walked away. Anna let out a slow breath. Then she rolled up her sleeves. The first thing she found was a broom handle without a broom head, leaning against the back wall like it had given up on its own purpose. She used it to knock down the heaviest cobwebs from the ceiling beams. Then she found a piece of burlap sacking in the corner and used it to clear the shelves. The dust came off in sheets, years of it, and she worked through the cloud it raised with her eyes half closed and her jaw set. The stove was her next problem. She spent 40 minutes with it before Samuel Hayes appeared in the doorway. Samuel Hayes was the ranch foreman, a thick-shouldered man in his mid-40s, with a face like old saddle leather, and eyes that seen enough hard seasons to stop expecting soft ones. He leaned against the doorframe and watched her work the rust on the stove's iron surface with a piece of rough pumice she'd found near the water pump. "You know that stove hasn't fired in 2 years," he said. "I can tell. Previous woman tried to use it, nearly took the barn with it when the flue backed up. Anna didn't stop working. When was the flue last cleaned?" Hayes paused. "Before Mrs. Walker passed, probably. So 3 years at least, give or take. Then that's why it backed up." Anna sat back on her heels and examined the iron surface. The rust was heavy, but not terminal. The stove was solid underneath. She could feel it. "Hand me that rag, would you? The one on the shelf behind you." Hayes looked at the shelf. There was indeed a rag there, gray with age. He handed it over without comment, then crossed his arms and watched as she continued working. "Where are you from?" he asked after a while. "Kansas." "Originally, long way from Kansas." "Yes, what happened to Kansas?" Anna paused just briefly, just a half-second catch in her movement before she continued. "A bad season happened, and then another one, and then the bank happened." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "Same thing that's happening here," he said. Just slower. Anna looked up at him then. His eyes were direct. He wasn't trying to be cruel, he was being honest, which she recognized as something different entirely. "How bad is it?" she asked. Hayes glanced toward the door, toward the direction Matthew had gone. Lowered his voice slightly. "Bad enough that he almost didn't post that advertisement. Bad enough that Charles Whitaker's been circling this property for 6 months making offers that get lower every time he makes one. And Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker lost his wife, and then he lost his fight," Hayes said plainly. "In that order. The ranch is still standing because the ranch was here before he stopped fighting, and it keeps running out of habit. But habits run out." He uncrossed his arms. "I'm telling you this not to frighten you off. I'm telling you because if you're going to work here you should know what you're working inside of." Anna looked at him steadily. "Why are you still here then, if it's that bad?" Hayes was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face, not quite grief, not quite loyalty, but something between them. "Because I was here when it was good," he said, "and I guess I keep thinking maybe it could be good again." He pushed off the doorframe and walked back out into the yard. Anna looked at the stove. "Me too," she said to the empty kitchen. She got the flue cleared before dark. It took a length of wire, a rag tied to the end of the broom handle, and 45 minutes of patience she did not entirely feel but performed anyway. When she finally drew the rag through, and it came out black with years of accumulated soot, she stood up straight and pressed her hand against the small of her back where the ache had settled. Then she found the small supply of hardwood split logs stacked against the outside of the building, half hidden by dead weeds, and she built the first fire. The stove smoked. She stood beside it with the door open, coaxing air through the damper, adjusting the draw until the smoke thinned and the fire caught clean. When the first true heat began to radiate from the iron surface, she put both palms flat against the warmth and felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized she was holding. Heat, the most basic thing, the beginning of everything. The kitchen supplies were nearly non-existent. She found flour in a tin that had stayed sealed, a small amount of salt, some dried beans, and a side of salted pork hanging in a back pantry she almost missed because the door was swelled shut from old moisture. She worked the door open with her shoulder and stood in the narrow space, taking inventory. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start. By 5:45 she had bean soup with salt pork on the stove, and biscuits flat, rough biscuits that she knew were imperfect, but they were real in the cast iron skillet she'd found hanging behind the door. Scraped clean and seasoned with the last of the lard she found in a sealed crock. At 6 o'clock she carried the pot and a stack of bowls to the long table outside the bunkhouse. The ranch hands came out of habit. 6 of them. They stopped when they smelled it. Stopped mid-conversation, mid-motion, the way people stop when something reaches them that they weren't expecting. A man named Eli Young, freckled, missing a tooth on the left side of his smile, looked at the pot, and then at Anna, and then at the pot again. "That's real food," he said. Not a question, just a statement made with a kind of reverence. "It's soup," Anna said. "Tomorrow I'll do better." Lady, in 6 months the best we've had is bread that had to be knocked against the table to knock the mold off one side. He picked up a bowl. This is a miracle, Anna almost smiled. It's beans and salt pork. Around here, another man said, older, with a beard the color of iron filings, that's the same thing. She watched them eat. She watched the way the conversation started up between them, cautious at first, then easier. She watched how a shared meal did something to a group of men who had been eating alone, or, in silence for too long, opened something, loosened something, reminded them of something they'd been without long enough to have almost forgotten its name. Community, that's what it was, the simple, irreplaceable thing. Matthew Walker was not among them. She learned the shape of the days quickly, up before light. Fire in the stove, whatever could be made from whatever was available. The ranch hands ate, they worked, she found things. The neglected kitchen garden behind the storage building was her second discovery, and it was a significant one. Nobody had touched it in at least 2 seasons, but the soil was still rich, dark, and loose. The way good soil stays if it isn't beaten out of itself, and what she found growing there in half-wild abandonment was more than she'd dared hope. Squash gone to seed but still viable. Kale that had survived the frosts through sheer stubbornness. Onions that had seeded themselves and come back without anyone asking them to. Wild herbs along the stone border, thyme, sage, something close to rosemary. She stood in that garden for a full minute before she started harvesting. Then she carried everything inside and got to work. By the end of the first week, she was feeding 12 men, something that deserved the word meal. Not just sustenance. Not just fuel. Something with flavor and intention. Something that said someone thought about what you needed before you sat down to eat it. The ranch hands noticed. Hayes noticed. Matthew Walker noticed. She could tell, because he changed his route around the property. He began passing the kitchen building at hours when he had no reason to pass it, slowing fractionally each time, not stopping, not speaking, but present in that careful sideways manner of a man who is paying attention and doesn't want anyone to know it. On the 9th day he stopped. Anna was outside the kitchen, repairing the lower shelf bracket she'd taken down because it was pulling away from the wall. She had a hammer and a handful of nails, and she was on her knees in the dirt, working the bracket back into position against the outer wall of the building. You're going to put a nail through your hand doing it that way. She didn't look up. I haven't yet. You've been doing it that way for 10 minutes. I watched. She looked up then. Matthew was standing 6 feet away with his arms at his sides and an expression that wasn't quite a frown, but wasn't anything warmer. His hat was off, she'd noticed. He took it off in the vicinity of women as an automatic reflex. One of those habits so old it had become involuntary. If you'd like to do it differently, she said, you're welcome to show me. He crouched down without a word, took the bracket from her, and positioned it correctly against the wall, two-handed, holding it flat and firm, while he extended his palm toward her for the nail. She gave him the nail. He drove it in 3 strikes. Clean and level. Second nail, he said. She gave him the second nail. 2 more strikes. He stood up, tested the bracket with a firm pull. It held. The wood is weak on the left side, he said. Give it a few months, and the nail will pull through again. You'll need to brace it from underneath. I know. She stood up, brushing the dirt from her knees. I just needed it to hold through winter. He looked at the bracket. Then at her, then back at the bracket. You're planning on still being here in winter, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I'm planning on still being here in spring, Anna said. Something passed across his face too quick to name. There and gone in a second. He put his hat back on. Supper was good last night, he said. Then he walked away. Anna looked after him for a moment. Thank you, she said to his back. He didn't turn around. But his step changed, just slightly, just enough. The first real crisis came at the end of the 2nd week, and it came from Charles Whitaker. Anna didn't know Whitaker by name yet when his man arrived, a thin, flat-eyed fellow named Perch, who rode in on a good horse and asked for Matthew Walker with the particular ease of someone who believes he comes representing power. She was at the water pump when he rode in. She watched him dismount and look around the yard with the assessing expression of someone calculating value, not the kind of value that comes from work and life and history. but the kind that comes from a ledger. Hayes intercepted him before he reached the house. Anna couldn't hear the exchange, but she watched it. Hayes's body language was controlled and rigid. Percy's was loose, confident. He handed Hayes a sealed envelope, said something, smiled with his teeth, rode back out. Hayes stood in the yard with the envelope for a moment. Then he looked toward the kitchen, and when his eyes found Anna's, something in his expression said he'd expected to be carrying worse news for longer, and was tired of the wait. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked over. Who was that? Man who works for Charles Whitaker. Hayes turned the envelope over in his hands. Whitaker's a cattle buyer out of Billings. Been after this property for 2 years. Every time things get harder here, he lowers his offer and sends another letter. What does he want with it? Land, water rights, the location. Walker Ranch sits on the best water source in the valley. Hayes looked at the envelope. Whitaker wants to consolidate it with 3 other properties he's already bought and run the whole corridor. And Mr. Walker, Hayes exhaled slowly. Matthew won't sell. But he won't fight either. And a man who won't fight is a man who's already halfway to losing. He handed Anna the envelope. Would you take this to him? I find I've delivered enough of these. Anna took the envelope. She looked at it, the heavy paper, the red wax seal, the neat script of the address. Then she carried it to the main house and knocked. Matthew answered in shirt sleeves, his hair slightly disordered, the look of a man who'd been sitting alone with something heavy. He saw the envelope and his eyes went flat. Whitaker, he said. His man came while you were out. Matthew took the envelope, looked at it, then set it down on the side table without opening it. He started to close the door, Mr. Walker. He paused. How long are you going to let his letters sit there before you respond to them? Anna asked. His expression sharpened. That's not your business, Miss Bennett. It is if his eventual success means I lose my position. A pause, longer than she expected. You're not going to lose your position. Because you're going to respond to him? Because I haven't decided anything yet. That's not the same as being safe, Anna said. Not deciding is the same as deciding eventually. The valley doesn't hold still while a man makes up his mind. Matthew looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something between anger and attention, the 2 states coexisting in him in a way that felt habitual, like they'd been sharing space in him for years. You've been here 2 weeks, he said. I know. You don't know this ranch. I know a man who's stopped fighting when he hasn't lost yet, Anna said. I've seen that before. On my own property, and I know what it looks like from the outside when it doesn't have to be that way. The silence between them was different from their previous silences. Less cold, more charged. Miss Bennett, Matthew said. He closed the door. Anna stood on the porch for a moment. Then she went back to her kitchen. She didn't sleep well that night. Not from worry. She had moved past the kind of worry that kept her awake and into the kind that simply moved through her days with her, a companion she'd learned to work alongside rather than fight. She lay in the small cot she'd assembled in the back corner of the kitchen, the fire banked low in the stove, the repaired windows holding against the wind, and she thought. She thought about Matthew Walker, not in the way she might have thought about a man she'd met under different circumstances, not with the cautious warmth of interest, not yet. She thought about him the way she thought about the stove when she first saw it, as something with good bones and serious damage, something that looked at first like a loss but was, on closer examination, possibly something else. The capacity was still there. She could see it. The question was whether anyone could reach it. She turned over and closed her eyes. Somewhere in the distance, one of the horses called out in the dark a low, carrying sound, half question and half statement, and then went quiet. She thought about Kansas. About the morning she'd stood in the field, behind what had been her farm, and felt the ground under her feet and known, with the particular certainty of something you've been approaching for months, that it was finished. That the earth wouldn't yield what she needed. That the debt was larger than the hope. She thought about the moment she'd made herself stand up straight and think forward instead of backward. And she thought about how that felt not good, not clean, not anything she'd recommend to anyone who had a choice. But real and possible, and hers. She fell asleep thinking about the garden. About what it could look like by spring. The third week brought three things. The first was cold a front that moved in from the northwest and dropped the temperature sharply, turning the mud in the yard to iron and putting frost on the inside of the kitchen windows in the mornings. The second was Eli's accident. The young ranch hand caught his leg in a fence wire on the east pasture while moving cattle, and the wire cut through his boot and into his calf badly enough that he couldn't walk on it. Two of the other men brought him in on a horse, and, because there was no doctor within 15, and the weather made the road uncertain, Anna became the closest thing available. She had some experience, not medical experience, not formal knowledge, but the experience of a woman who had lived in isolated places and learned that necessity taught faster than school. She cleaned the wound with the whiskey haze, brought Eli made a sound through his teeth that he immediately converted into a word that made the two men nearby step back with impressed expressions. And she packed it with clean linen and bound it firm. "Gonna need stitching," Hayes said, looking at it. "I know," Anna said. "Hold him still." She had a sewing needle and thread. She sterilized both in the whiskey. Eli gripped the edge of the bunk frame until his knuckles went white, and he looked at the ceiling the entire time with the expression of a man working very hard to exist somewhere else mentally, and he did not make another sound. When it was done, Anna tied off the last stitch and sat back. "You're going to need to stay off that leg," she said. "For how long? A week too, if you're sensible. I've got cattle too. You have a wound that will open back up and turn septic if you push it, and then you'll have nothing to do with cattle ever again, because you won't be here." She said it flat and calm, without cruelty. "A week, then we reassess." Eli looked at her. "You always talk to men like that?" "I talk to anyone like that when they're about to do something stupid." From the doorway, Hayes made a sound that, in a man less severe, might have been a laugh. The third thing that week was Matthew. He came to the kitchen on Thursday evening, after the hands had eaten and gone, and he sat down at the work table, not in the chair, not comfortably, but on the edge of it. The posture of a man who hasn't decided whether he's staying, and he watched her clean up. She let him watch, let the silence sit. She was not a woman who felt compelled to fill silence with sound. After 10 minutes he said, "The men are working better." She stacked the cleaned bowls on the repaired shelf. "I noticed," Hayes said, "the afternoon output is up by a third. Hard work and good food are related. That's not a surprise." "No." A pause. "It's not." He looked at the stove she had brought back from rust and neglect, that now radiated heat and reliability every hour of every day. "When I put you in here," he said, "I expected you to last 4 days." Anna turned to look at him. "Why 4? That seemed about right." "Based on experience." "Experience with what?" "With people coming here and finding out what's actually here." He met her eyes. "Most people see this ranch the way it is now, not the way it was. They see the deficit. They calculate the gap between where it is and where they hoped it would be. And then they leave." "I calculated the gap," Anna said. "And I decided the gap was closable." Matthew was quiet for a moment. "Why?" he asked. "You don't have any investment here." "No reason to care." Anna dried her hands on the apron. She thought about how to say what she was thinking, and then she decided to say it plainly, the way she said most things. "Everyone has been telling you what this ranch is missing," she said. "What it's lost, what it used to be." She looked at him. "But I've been here 3 weeks, and what I see is a ranch that's still standing. Cattle that are still valuable, land that's still rich. Men who are still showing up to work even though the morale has been low and the pay is uncertain." She paused. "That's not a failing ranch, Mr. Walker. That's a ranch that keeps running because it has enough underneath it to keep running. It needs someone to look at what's actually here instead of mourning what isn't." Matthew Walker looked at her. It was a long look, the kind that lands somewhere specific and stays. "Mrs. Walker used to say something like that," he said quietly. The air in the room changed. Anna didn't move, didn't speak. "Not about the ranch," he said. "About people." He looked at his hands. She had a way of seeing the capacity in things. He paused. "I used to think it was something she was born with. Something particular to her." Another pause. "I'm not entirely certain anymore." Anna thought about a dozen responses and said none of them. Instead she said, "Would you like a cup of coffee, Mr. Walker, he looked up. I found a small supply in the back pantry, she added. It's real coffee. Not the burn grant substitute the men have been drinking. Something moved across his face. Very slight. The ghost of something that had once, in a different life, been familiar. Yes, he said. All right. She put the coffee on. And Matthew Walker stayed in the kitchen for another hour. He didn't say very much, but he stayed, and in that kitchen, in that particular hour, the staying felt like something neither of them had words for yet, but both of them recognized. The beginning of something. Not love, not yet. Not with the walls still standing the way they were, not with the losses still sitting between them like stones. But a beginning, and in that kitchen, in that hour, a beginning was enough. The coffee was gone by the time Matthew stood up to leave, and Anna noticed he'd stayed longer than either of them intended. He didn't say good night. He simply put on his hat, looked at the stove one more time, with that unreadable expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of acknowledgement, and walked out into the dark. She listened to his boots cross the yard until the sound disappeared, and then she sat down in the chair he'd vacated, and let herself feel the tiredness she'd been carrying all day. The wood of the chair was still warm. She noticed that. Filed it away somewhere she didn't examine too closely. The next morning she was up before the stars faded, as she had been every morning since she arrived. The fire came alive quickly now the stove had learned her, or she had learned it, or both, the way a working relationship finds its rhythm through repetition and patience. She had biscuits started in the bean pot from the night, before warming on the back burner, when Hayes appeared in the doorway at 4:45, earlier than usual, with an expression that told her before he spoke that something had changed overnight. We've got a problem, he said. Come in. He came in and stood with his hat in his hands, turning it the way men turned hats when they were choosing words carefully. Whitaker's man was back this morning, before light. Talked to two of the ranch hands privately. He looked at her. Offered them positions at his operation, better pay. More stability. Anna kept her hands moving, kept working the dough. Did they take it? Not yet, but Peterson is close. He's got a family in town, and the uncertainty here is eating at him. Hayes set his hat on the table. If we lose Peterson, we lose Davies too, because Davies follows Peterson the same way a dog follows whoever fed it last. That's two hands. Two hands I can't replace this time of year with winter coming. Does Mr. Walker know? I'm telling you first, because I'm not sure how he'll take it. Hayes sat down across from 6 months ago. I would have told him, and he'd have had a plan before I finished the sentence. Now I don't know if he'll get angry or just go quiet. And right now I need someone who'll do something. Not someone who goes quiet. Anna looked at him steadily. She understood what he was asking. She also understood that what he was asking was outside the official boundary of her position, which was to cook and maintain the household, not to manage ranch politics, or prop up the resolve of the man who owned the property. She understood all of that, and she answered him anyway. Get Peterson and Davies to the kitchen for breakfast before the others. Separately if you can. Hayes blinked. Why? Because people talk differently at a table than they do in a yard, Anna said. And because a man who is fed well and feels like someone notices him is harder to poach than a man who feels like he's invisible. She shaped the last biscuit and set it in the pan. I can't offer Peterson more pay, but I can offer him something Whitaker's operation probably doesn't have. What's that? A reason to stay that doesn't come down to money. Hayes picked up his hat. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was beginning to recognize in the men on this ranch, a kind of recalibration. Something shifting in their estimation of who she was and what she was doing here. All right, he said. He left to find Peterson and Davies. Peterson was a big man, 32, with a wife named Caroline in Willow Creek and two small boys under 5. He had the permanently tired expression of someone carrying more than work, the particular exhaustion of a man who lay awake, counting what he owed against what he had. When he sat down at Anna's table, he was polite but wary, the way men are when they suspect they're about to be talked out of something they've already decided. Anna put a plate in front of him. Real eggs, sourced from the 3 hens she'd found half-feral in the back of the old barn and coaxed back into reliable production over the past week. Thick sliced salt pork, Biscuits with a scraping of the butter she'd been making from the single dairy cow Hayes had told her was there, but who nobody had been milking regularly. Peterson looked at the plate. He looked up at Anna. "Mr. Hayes said you wanted to talk," he said carefully. "I wanted to feed you," Anna said, pouring coffee. "The talking can wait until you've eaten." He ate. The wariness didn't disappear entirely, but it loosened, the way a man's body changes when it receives something it needed badly enough that the need had stopped feeling like a feeling and started feeling like a fact. Halfway through the plate, he said, without looking up, "Whitaker's offer is real money. I know, more than I'm making here. I know that too. My wife Caroline, she's been patient." He set his fork down for a moment. "But patient runs out, and I've got boys to feed, and a roof that needs work, and the uncertainty here has been sitting on my chest for 6 months, like something I can't shake off." Anna sat down across from him. Not across the wide span of the table, but close, the way women sit when they're actually listening rather than managing. "What did you do before you came to Walker Ranch?" she asked. He looked up, surprised by the question's direction. "Worked a spread outside of Bozeman, small operation. Good people. What made you leave?" "Owner sold to a larger outfit. We all got let go." Something flickered in his expression. "Spent a year drifting before Hayes found me and offered me a position here. Matthew Walker offered a fair wage and a stable situation, and after a year of nothing I would have worked for a room and board." "And Walker, in those early years?" Peterson's expression changed. Softened in a complicated way, not sentimentality, but something like honest recollection. "Different man," he said quietly. "Before Mrs. Walker passed, it was a good place to work. Not just the money, the way the operation ran, the way he treated his people. You felt like you were building something that mattered." He picked up his fork again, then set it back down. "I stayed through the hard time because I remembered that. Because I kept thinking he'd come back to himself." He exhaled. "It's been 2 years. He's coming back," Anna said. Peterson looked at her directly. "You've been here 3 weeks." "I know. 3 weeks isn't enough to know that." "No," she agreed. "It's not enough to know it, but it's enough to see it. And I've seen enough to believe it's possible." She paused. "What I'm asking you is whether you can give it time to prove out. Not forever, not open-ended. I'm asking for until spring. If by spring this ranch hasn't shown real signs of recovery, you'll leave with my blessing, and I'll write Caroline a personal letter explaining that you made the right choice for your family." Peterson stared at her. "Why would you do that?" "Because you staying through winter isn't just about you," Anna said. "It's about what this ranch can become. And what it becomes affects everyone who works here, everyone who depends on it. Including families like yours." She held his gaze. "And because I don't think you actually want to go work for Charles Whitaker. I think you want a reason to stay." A long silence. Outside, the wind had picked up again, moving hard from the northwest. They could hear it working against the newly repaired roof above them, testing the fresh patches she'd had Eli supervise from his bunk. She'd described exactly what needed doing, and he'd talked the other men through it with his leg elevated and his particular gift for making orders sound like suggestions. "Until spring," Peterson said finally, "until spring." He finished his breakfast. Davies, when he sat down 20 minutes later, simply ate everything on the plate, what Yethard Peterson's expression when they passed each other in the doorway, and said to Anna, "Whatever you said to him. Say it to me too." She said it to him too. Neither man was gone. Hayes found her in the garden, digging up the last of the season's root vegetables before the ground hardened completely, and he stood at the garden's edge and shook his head slowly. "How did you do that?" he asked. Anna handed him a bunch of parsnips to carry. "I fed them, and I listened to them, and I told them the truth." "What truth? That this ranch is worth staying for." She straightened up. "Whether Matthew Walker can hear that yet or not." Hayes took the parsnips and fell into step beside her. "He was watching from the barn," Hayes said, "while you talked to Peterson. I don't know if he heard anything, but he was watching." Anna said nothing to that, but something tightened in her chest, just briefly, and then released. She kept walking toward the kitchen. The confrontation with Matthew came 3 days later, and it came the way real confrontations usually come, not when you're ready for them, not with any of the preamble that would make them easier, but sideways and sudden, out of something small. She was patching a section of the kitchen's outer wall where the old boards had split and let in cold air. She had a piece of spare lumber and a handful of nails, and she was working by feel and stubbornness, neither of which had failed her yet, when Matthew came around the corner of the building and stopped. "What are you doing?" "Patching the wall, I can see that." He came closer. "Why?" "Because the cold is getting in, and the stove can only do so much against a drafty building." She drove a nail. "Also because there are stores in that back pantry now, and I need the temperature consistent, or I'll lose what I've managed to put up." "You've been storing food?" "All month." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him processing this, the fact that she'd been working at a level of forward planning that went beyond what he'd asked of her, beyond what the job required. I didn't ask you to do that." "No." She drove another nail. "I did it because it needed doing. The stores are my concern." She stopped, turned to face him fully. "Mr. Walker. With respect, I have been here 4 weeks. In 4 weeks I have restored a kitchen that nobody believed was usable. I have been feeding 12 men 3 meals a day from a supply situation that was, when I arrived, nearly non-existent. I have rebuilt your kitchen garden, repaired 2 structural failures in this building, negotiated the continued employment of 2 ranch hands who were about to leave for Charles Whitaker's operation, and put up enough preserved food to carry this kitchen through 2 months of hard winter." She looked at him steadily. "If any of that concerns you, I'd genuinely like to know how." The silence was sharp. Matthew's jaw worked once, the way his did when he was pushing something back rather than saying it. "Peterson told me," he said finally quietly, "what you said to him." Anna waited. "He didn't have to tell me. He volunteered it." Matthew looked toward the far fence line. "He said you told him the ranch was worth staying for." "I believe it is. You've been here a month, I know." Anna. It was the first time he'd used her given name. It came out without ceremony, without apparent intention. The way names come out, when the careful distance has worn thin enough in one particular moment to let something through. He seemed to register it himself, a brief shift in his expression, but he didn't correct it. "You can't know this ranch is worth staying for. You don't know what it was, or what it's cost to keep it standing, or what it would take to actually recover it. You don't know any of that." "Then tell me," she said. He looked at her. "Tell me what it would take," she said. "Stop letting me guess and start treating me like someone who's actually here and actually working and might actually be able to help if you'd give me enough information to work with." She held his gaze. "Because right now you're fighting Charles Whitaker with one hand while keeping the other hand behind your back. And I can't help you if you won't let me see what we're working with." The wind pushed hard through the yard and carried the sound of cattle from the near pasture, and somewhere a gate banged twice against its latch. Matthew was quiet for so long that she thought he was going to turn and leave the way he usually did, that retreat into silence that she'd come to recognize as his primary defensive structure. He didn't. "Come with me," he said. She followed him to the main house, which she had not yet entered since that single evening she'd knocked to deliver Whitaker's letter. The inside was orderly in the way of a man who maintained control over his physical environment as compensation for everything else, everything in its place, nothing unnecessary, the particular austere tidiness of grief. He sat down at the desk in the front room and pulled out a ledger. She sat across from him. He opened the ledger and turned it toward her. "This is where the ranch stands financially." She read the numbers. She was not an accountant. She had never been trained in formal bookkeeping. But she had run a farm, and she knew what a ledger meant, in the way that people who live by ledgers learn to know viscerally, practically, in the gut. The numbers were serious, not catastrophic, not yet. But serious in the way that said, serious could become catastrophic by spring if nothing changed. "Whitaker's latest offer," Matthew said, pulling out a separate paper. She looked at the number. It was insultingly low. Not low in the way of a first negotiating position, low in the way of a man who believes the person he's offering to knows they're beaten. "He thinks you'll take it," Anna said. "Most people in the valley think I'll take it." "Will you?" Matthew looked at the ledger. 6 months ago I would have said no without hesitation. He exhaled slowly. Now I look at those numbers and I think about everything that needs to happen between where we are and where the ranch could be, and I don't always know what the honest answer is. Anna looked at the numbers again. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. The cattle operation Hayes tells me the herd is actually in good shape. The cattle are healthy, and the breeding stock is strong. That's correct. What happened to the revenue from last season's drive? A pause. Most of it went to the banknote, most of it. There were expenses, costs I didn't anticipate. He paused again. I was not paying close attention to certain things last year. After Elizabeth died, my management of the financial details was not. I was not reliable. I paid bills I'd already paid. I missed a revenue I should have captured. He said it plainly, without asking for pity. Just facts. The way he said most things, Hayes caught some of it. Not all, so the loss wasn't entirely from the ranch's performance. No, a brief tight look crossed his face, something like shame, except worn too long to be acute. More like a scar than a wound. Some of it was mine. Anna closed the ledger gently. Then the problem is partially recoverable, she said. He looked at her. The cattle are sound, the land is sound. The labor we keep Peterson and Davies that holds. The food costs are coming down as the kitchen gets back to producing properly. She looked at him. If you stop the financial bleed from mismanagement, which means you have to actually be present, Mr. Walker, actually looking at the numbers every week instead of letting them sit, and
if we can show from the improved yields from this
small drive, the banknote is serviceable. That's a great many ifs. She held his gaze. It is. That's what a recovery looks like. It's made of ifs. You make enough of them certainties, and eventually the ledger reads differently. Matthew stared at her. Something was moving in his expression that she'd learned not to name too quickly, because whatever it was complicated by everything that had happened to him, and it didn't fit neatly into the emotional categories she'd have used before she understood his particular history. My wife, he started. Stopped. Anna waited. Elizabeth was the one who kept the ledger before she became ill, he said. She had a way with numbers. She saw patterns in them that I missed. He looked at the closed ledger. After she died, I kept it myself because I couldn't stand the idea of someone else sitting at her desk touching her work. His voice was even. Controlled. But the control was the kind that exists specifically because the thing beneath it is not. I did a poor job of it. That's understandable, Anna said quietly. It's not an excuse. I didn't call it an excuse. Another silence, but this one had a different texture, less guarded. More like two people in a room that had grown small enough to require honesty. I'll keep the ledger if you want me to, Anna said. Not instead of you, with you. You know the cattle operation. I know household accounts and supply management. Between the two of us, we'd see more than either of us alone. Matthew looked at her for a long moment. That would require you to stay, he said. I said I planned to be here in spring. Yes. He looked at the ledger again. You did say that. He picked it up and held it for a moment. Then he held it out to her. She took it. The weight of it was surprising, not physically. It was a slim enough volume, but in the way it landed in her hands. The weight of something significant passes between two people who are both still figuring out what it means. She stood to leave. At the door she stopped. Mr. Walker, one more thing. What? You need to ride the full property this week. Every pasture, every fence line. Not because Hayes can't tell you the condition, he can. But because the men need to see you doing it. She held his gaze. They need to know you're still here, not just present. Here. Matthew said nothing, but the following morning she heard his horse leave the yard before she'd finished banking the first fire. She was at the window when he rode out. He rode straight, backed, the way she'd seen him move when he had somewhere to be and knew it. She turned back to the stove. The day after that, Eli limped into the kitchen on his healing leg, still 3 days ahead of the schedule she'd given him, and reported that the men had worked harder yesterday than they had in months. Why? Anna asked without looking up from the bread she was shaping. Because Walker rode the whole property, Eli said. Stopped at every section, talked to the men in the north pasture for 20 minutes. Checked the water situation at the East Creek himself. He paused. Last time he did, that was nobody could remember the last time. Before Mrs. Walker, probably. Another pause. Whatever you said to him. I told him the truth, Anna said. It worked. Sometimes it does. Eli sat down carefully, favoring his leg, and accepted the biscuit she passed him without being asked. He ate it and looked at her with the particular directness of the young, which goes places caution hasn't yet taught them to avoid. You're not what we expected, he said. What did you expect? Someone who'd fix the cooking and leave. He looked at his biscuit. Not someone who'd fix everything else too. Anna went back to her bread. I'm just doing the job. No, you're not, Eli said simply. You're doing about 4 jobs. And you're doing them all without anyone asking you to. She thought about that for a moment. Some jobs need doing whether anyone asks or not, she said. Eli was quiet. Then, carefully, is he going to be all right, Walker? Anna paused in her work. She thought about the man who'd handed her his ledger, who'd ridden his entire property at dawn because someone had told him his men needed to see him present, who kept a desk where his wife had once sat and couldn't bear to let anyone else touch it. Yes, she said. She said it firmly, not because she was certain, but because certainty sometimes was something you had to commit to before the evidence was entirely in. I think he is. Eli nodded as if that settled something he'd been worrying at for a while. He finished his biscuit and went back to work on his healing leg, moving carefully out into a morning that had gone pale and bright with the first frost sitting on everything, making the world look clean and new and like it decided, overnight, to try again. Anna watched him go. Then she went back to her bread, and her kitchen, and the slow, necessary, unglamorous work of putting things back together one stubborn day at a time. The letter from the bank arrived on a Tuesday, sealed in an envelope that looked official enough to make even Hayes's face go careful when he set it on her work table alongside the mail. She took it to Matthew that evening, and when he read it, the color left his face in a way she'd not seen before, not sadness, but the particular pallor of something more immediate. He set the letter down. They're accelerating the note, he said. Calling the full balance in 90 days, Anna looked at him. Someone, Matthew said, has purchased my debt. The silence that followed was the kind that happened when 2 people understood simultaneously, without having to say it, exactly who had made that move and exactly what it meant. Charles Whitaker had stopped waiting. Charles Whitaker had stopped waiting. The realization landed in that room the way a stone lands in still water, not loud, but spreading, the implications moving outward in every direction at once. Matthew sat with the bank letter in his hand and his face arranged in that controlled expression Anna had learned to read as the outer boundary of something much less controlled underneath. She did not let the silence run too long. 90 days, she said. Yes, that's not nothing. Matthew set the letter down. It's not enough. How much is the full balance? He told her. She kept her expression steady. It was significant. Not impossible, but significant in the way that made the distance between where they stood and where they needed to be feel very real and very cold. What's the cattle drive revenue looking like for spring? She asked. If the herd stays healthy through winter and we get fair pricing in Billings reasonable. Not enough. His voice was flat in the way of someone making themselves say accurate things instead of hopeful ones. Not enough to clear the note in 90 days. Then we need another approach. He looked at her. I've been thinking of no other thing for the past 10 minutes. Good, she sat down across from him, then think out loud. With me. Because right now you're the only person in this room who knows the full financial picture of this operation, and I need you to stop managing what I know and start treating me like someone who can help you solve this. Matthew looked at her for a moment. With that expression, she'd stopped trying to categorize the one that existed in the space between resistance and something it was slowly becoming. The North Timber, he said. She waited. I own the timber rights on the North Ridge. I've never sold them, because I didn't need to. He paused. A lumber company out of Helena has approached twice in the past year. I turned them down both times. How much? He told her. It wasn't the full note, but it was substantial. Combined with the cattle drive revenue, it was enough with careful management, with no further surprises. With everything going close to right, it was enough to make 90 days survivable. Can you negotiate the payment timeline with the lumber company? Possibly, their interest is real, they want the timber. Then do it tomorrow. Anna leaned forward slightly. Don't wait. Don't think about it for 3 more days. Tomorrow morning you write to them, and you make the offer, and you start the conversation before Whitaker has time to make another move. Because the moment he realizes the timber rights exist, he'll try to leverage those too. Matthew stared at her. How do you know he doesn't already know? He asked. Does Perch come back after dropping envelopes? No. Then Whitaker's information on your property is incomplete. He knows the land value, and the cattle, and the water rights. If he knew about the timber, he'd have mentioned it already. Men like Whitaker use every lever they have the moment they have it. She held Matthew's gaze. You have a window, it's narrow, use it. The silence that followed was different from his previous silences. Not retreat. Something more like a man standing at the edge of a decision and finding that the ground is more solid than he expected it to be. You think like a strategist, he said. I think like someone who's lost a farm, Anna said. And who learned what she should have done differently. Matthew picked up the bank letter, looked at it once more, and set it in the desk drawer. The gesture was deliberate, filing it as a problem with a plan, rather than a catastrophe without one. I'll write the letter tonight, he said. She stood up. Good, Anna. She's thank you, he said quietly. Just those 2 words, without anything additional to soften or explain them. Just the words themselves, direct and unguarded in the way she was beginning to understand, was the most authentic version of him. Get some sleep, she said. You'll think better in the morning. She walked back across the dark yard to her kitchen and sat down on the edge of her cot with her hands in her lap and allowed herself to feel the weight of everything for exactly 5 minutes. The banknote, the 90 days, the timer that was now running on everything she and the men on this ranch had been building. Then she lay down, closed her eyes, and was asleep in 3 minutes. Some things you couldn't afford to carry into sleep. She'd learned that in Kansas. The letter went to Helena the next morning, with the supply rider. In the 11 days it took to get a response, Anna watched Matthew change. Not dramatically. Not in ways anyone who didn't know how to look for them would have noticed. But she noticed he began attending the ledger reviews she'd started keeping at the kitchen table every Sunday evening, sitting across from her with his coffee, going through the numbers with her, his eyes tracking the columns with the attention of a man who had remembered that attention was something he owed this place. He asked questions, real ones, about the food stores, the supply costs, where she'd found deficiencies, what she was planning for the winter. He listened to the answers with the focused quality of someone who had decided to be present and was applying himself to it with the same discipline he applied to everything else. The ranch hands felt it. Eli said it first, because Eli always said things first, the way young men do before they learn that timing matters as much as truth. Walker looked me in the eye this morning, he announced at the breakfast table one morning, mid-bite, with the wonder of someone reporting a meteorological event. Not just looked at me, actually looked at me, said my name. Davies, older, said nothing but nodded once. The slow nod of a man who has been quietly watching something shift and is relieved to find he wasn't imagining it. Peterson set down his fork. He rode with us yesterday. North pasture, 2 hours. Didn't say much, but he was there. He paused. Last time I worked a property where the owner rode alongside his men. I thought about that job for 10 years after I left it. Anna poured coffee and said nothing. She did not say, I know. I see it too. I see him coming back piece by piece, like a man climbing out of something deep and cold, and I am trying not to watch too closely, because watching too closely feels like a thing that needs careful management. She said none of that. She poured coffee and went back to the stove. The response from the Helena Lumber Company arrived on a Thursday. They were interested. They were very interested. Matthew came to the kitchen that evening, with the letter, and read sections of it to her across the work table. And she watched his face while he read, and saw something she had not seen there before, not happiness. That was too simple, but the particular expression of a man who has been holding himself braced against impact for so long that the first moment of unexpected relief registers almost like pain, because the muscles don't immediately know the difference. They want to send a representative, he said, next week if possible. To survey the timber and finalize terms, except, Anna said immediately. The terms they're suggesting are negotiable, and you'll get better ones in person than on paper, she said. Accept the meeting and negotiate face to face. You're better in person. I've watched you. With the men, you're better when you can read the room. He looked up from the letter. You've been watching me, he said. Not an accusation. More like someone noting something unexpected and deciding what to do with the information. I've been watching this whole ranch, Anna said evenly. It's part of doing the job well. And what do you see? He asked. The question was quiet, with a quality that suggested he actually wanted the answer, which was different from his usual questions, which were more often positioned as challenges. She considered. I see a man who is good at this, she said finally. Who was always good at this and who stopped believing it. The capability never left, it just got buried under everything else. She held his gaze. I see it coming back, slowly, but it's coming. Matthew looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the letter. I'll send the acceptance tonight, he said. The lumber company representative arrived on a Tuesday, a compact, careful man named Aldrich who wore city clothes and had the assessing eyes of someone accustomed to calculating value per acre. He came with an assistant who took notes. He shook Matthew's hand and looked around the yard, with the professional neutrality of a man trained not to show enthusiasm too early. Anna fed them lunch. She had been planning that lunch since the letter arrived. Not ostentatiously, nothing that would seem like display, but well. Good bread, the preserved harvest vegetables that had been stored in the repaired pantry, a roasted joint that used the best of what the ranch's own resources could provide. Coffee from the supply she carefully rationed because real coffee was a statement of stability in a way that the burned grain substitute was not. Aldrich ate without comment for the first few minutes. Then he looked up. This is excellent, he said simply. Thank you, Anna said, and refilled his coffee, and left them to it. She did not attend the negotiation, that was not her place, and she knew the precise boundaries of what was hers to manage and what was not. But she heard the voices from the main house, the low professional tone of men conducting business, and she tracked the duration of the meeting the way you track weather. Not because you control it, but because it affects everything you're responsible for. 3 hours. When Aldrich and his assistant rode out, Matthew came directly to the kitchen. He stood in the doorway. His expression was the closest thing to open she had ever seen on him. We have a deal, he said. Anna set down the pot she was holding. The terms? He told her. The terms were better than the letter had suggested. Significantly better. The kind of better you get when the man across the table has recovered enough of himself to negotiate from capability rather than desperation. She did the arithmetic quickly in her head, the way she'd been doing arithmetic since the night she'd first seen the ledger. Combined with the projected cattle drive revenue, measured against the banknote and the 90-day window. It worked. It was close. It required everything to go right or close to right. It required no new disasters between now and spring. But it worked. We can clear the note, she said. Yes, his voice was different. Not triumphant. Matthew Walker was not a man given to triumph, but something quieter and more durable. Relieved. Yes, we can. She nodded. She turned back to the stove because she needed a moment, and turning to the stove gave her one. And she stood there with her back to him for a few seconds, and felt something that she could only describe as the specific feeling of having wanted something to work out, and having watched it begin to do exactly that. Anna, she turned. He was still in the doorway. He had his hat in his hands, the way he'd had it the night she'd kept his ledger, and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't deflect this time because it was too direct and there was nowhere else in the room for her eyes to go. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. He stopped, tried again. What you've done here. What you've been doing since the day you arrived. I need you to know that I'm aware of it. Not just the kitchen and the food and the stores, the men. Peterson, Davies, Eli's leg, the garden, the ledger. He paused. The way you talked to me the night I nearly didn't write the letter to Helena. You would have written it, Anna said. I don't know that. I do. He looked at her steadily. You have more confidence in me than I've earned. Or, she said quietly, I can see clearly because I don't have to carry everything you're carrying. That's not a virtue on my part, it's just a position. Matthew was quiet for a moment. Elizabeth would have liked you, he said. It was the most unguarded thing he'd ever said to her. She felt the weight of it, the trust inside it, the particular courage of a man who loved someone deeply and was saying so by placing that person's name in the same breath as someone new. I would have liked her, Anna said, from everything I can see. A beet. Her garden, Matthew said, the one behind the old kitchen. She planted it the second spring after we married. Said she wanted the kitchen to feed itself. He paused. I never went back there after she died. I let it go. I know, Anna said gently. I found it. I know you did. He looked at his hands. I watched you working in it the first week you were here. I watched from the barn and I thought she'd have called it stubborn and meant it as a compliment. The fire in the stove moved against its grate. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The timber deal needs paperwork drawn up, Matthew said finally, returning to solid ground. Aldrich will send the formal documents from Helena within the week. All right, and I want to go through the ledger with you this Sunday. I want to map out exactly how the note payments sequence against the timber proceeds and the drive revenue. I'll have the figures ready. He put his hat back on. He looked at her one more time before he turned to go, and the look was brief, but it was the kind of brief that contains more than longer ones. He was almost to the main house when Hayes came around the corner of the barn at a near run, which was not a thing Hayes did. Hayes moved at one measured pace in all circumstances, and seeing him move fast sent a cold current through the yard, before he'd said a single word. Fire, Hayes said. East storage barn, it's caught the hay. The world compressed. Anna was already moving before the word fully registered. She heard Matthew shout something to Hayes, and heard boots crossing the yard at speed, and heard the distant crackling that she'd processed as wind until she processed it correctly. And then she was running with them, with a clarity that emergency produces in people who have known emergency before. The east storage barn held the winter hay supply, all of it. If that went, the cattle had nothing through winter. The ranch had nothing. The scene that met her was not chaos exactly, but the thing just before chaos, men appearing from bunkhouse and pasture, some with buckets already. The particular organized panic of people who know what needs to happen and are racing the spread of the fire to make it happen in time. The hay was burning on the south end of the barn. The north end, where the bulk of the supply was stored, had not yet caught. Matthew was already organizing a bucket line from the water trough to the barn's side wall, his voice snapping clear instructions with an authority that had no gap in it. No hesitation. The man she'd been watching reassemble himself for 6 weeks had arrived all at once in this moment, fully present, doing what he was built to do. She did not stop to calculate. She went to the barn's north end. There was a gap in the wall, an old drainage gap near the base, barely wide enough to matter. But she could see the fire hadn't reached the north hay yet. If the wall held, if they could get water on the south end fast enough, the bulk of the supply could be saved. Hayes appeared beside her. Get back, he said. The north supply is intact, she said. If we get the south wall wet enough to stop the spread. I know, I'm doing it. You get back. I can carry water as fast as any man here. I know that too. Hayes looked at her directly, his voice dropping the argument and picking up something more urgent. Go find the tool cache on the east side of the building. There's a fire break axe in it. If the wall goes, we may need to cut a break. She went. She found the axe. She brought it back to Hayes, who took it and held it ready while the bucket line worked, while Matthew moved with his men, with a coordination she had never seen from him before, fluid, purposeful. The leadership of someone who had never actually lost it, only lost the will to apply it. The fire was bad. It was very bad for 20 minutes. The longest 20 minutes Anna could remember, since the night she'd made her final decision about Kansas, standing in the field and knowing what she had to let go. She stood at the north end of the barn, with her hands gripping a length of rope from the wall rack, and she watched the bucket line, and she breathed, and she did not let the mathematics of what they, west, might lose run further than the immediate next moment. The next bucket, the next break in the wind, the next inch of fire that didn't spread. Eli appeared beside her, on his healing leg that he wasn't supposed to be stressing. His face was set in the fierce concentration of someone who has decided the injury is irrelevant. "South wall is holding," he said. "How's the line?" "Good. Walker's running it himself." The man Eli stopped. Shook his head. "The man is something different tonight." Anna looked toward where Matthew was. He was at the center of the bucket line, passing and directing, and moving with the total immersion of someone who had located himself completely in the present moment. No weight of grief on those shoulders right now, no distance in those pale gray eyes. Just the immediate, necessary, urgent work of saving what was his and what belonged to the people who depended on him. That's who he is, she thought. That's the man underneath everything else. 40 minutes after it started, the fire was contained to the south corner of the barn. The north supply 3/4 of the winter hay was intact. The south corner was a loss but a survivable one. They could source additional hay from a neighboring ranch through trade. It would cost, but it was manageable. When it was finally out, the men stood around the perimeter in the particular silence of people whose bodies are still running hot on adrenaline, but whose crisis is over. Someone coughed. Someone else sat down heavily on the ground and just stayed there. Matthew stood in the middle of it. He was covered in ash and smoke. His coat had a scorched area on the left sleeve, where he'd gotten too close to the burning wall at some point. He was breathing hard, controlled, coming down from it. He looked at his men. "Good work," he said. "It came out rough. Every one of you. Good work." Something moved through the group, not celebration, too exhausted for that, but something like recognition. The workers looking at their employer and seeing him fully for the first time in a long time. Present, grateful. Then Matthew's eyes found Anna. She was standing at the edge of the group, still holding the length of rope she'd had in her hands, her clothes carrying the same ash smell as everyone else's. She had a burn mark on her right wrist she hadn't registered until this moment, where a spark had landed during one of the water runs, small and stinging now that the adrenaline was leaving. Matthew walked toward her. He stopped 3 feet away and looked at the burn on her wrist with an expression that moved through several stages very quickly, none of which were simple. "You need to put cold water on that," he said. "I know." "Now, not in a while now, all right." He didn't move. His jaw worked once. He looked at the barn, at the men, and then back at her. "When Hayes told you to get back," he said. "I got the axe," she said. "That's not the same as getting back." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He exhaled through his nose, the sound of a man working through something that was going to take longer than this moment to fully resolve. "This ranch saved me when I had nowhere else," Anna said quietly. His eyes came back to hers. "I arrived here with a bag and a position that barely existed and a kitchen that nobody had wanted in years," she said. "And it gave me," she paused, because the word was large, and she meant it precisely purpose. "Work that mattered, a place to be." Her voice held steady. "I wasn't going to stand at a safe distance while it burned." Matthew Walker looked at her. He looked at her the way he looked at the ledger the first night she'd studied it with him, with the careful, thorough attention of someone taking inventory of something that matters. Then he said, so quietly she almost missed it, through the sounds of men dispersing and horses settling and the last of the smoke thinning into the dark sky above them, "Neither was I." They stood there in the burned, smelling, ash-drifted yard, 3 feet apart, the ranch still standing around them in its imperfect and recovering and stubbornly alive state. Neither of them moved. And in that stillness between two people who had both been through enough loss to know what solid ground felt like, when they finally found it again, something shifted. Quietly, irreversibly, the way foundations shift when they're taking on weight they were built to hold. Hayes appeared at a respectful distance. He looked at both of them. He was not a man who missed things, and he did not miss this, and he had the grace not to say anything about it. "I'll see to the men," he said simply, and left them where they stood. The burn on her wrist was small enough to be practical about, and significant enough that Matthew made her deal with it before he let her go anywhere else. He brought the cold water himself, not Hayes, not Eli. He went to the pump, filled a clean basin, and carried it to the kitchen where she'd finally sat down, on the edge of the work table, the rope still in her other hand because she'd forgotten she was holding it. He set the basin in front of her and looked at her wrist and then at her face with the expression of a man conducting a second inventory he hadn't planned for. "Put it in," he said. She put her wrist in the water. The cold hit the burn, and she felt it properly, for the first time, the sharp, clarifying pain of an injury, finally receiving attention after the body's emergency systems have finished overriding everything else. She kept her face neutral. She'd had worse. Matthew sat down across from her and watched her swap, with his forearms on the table and his hands clasped, the posture of a man who is staying because he has decided to stay and doesn't intend to be moved from that decision. The fire was set, he said. She looked up. Hayes found the accelerant on the south wall. Old coal oil, soaked into the lower boards. His voice was level, controlled, in that particular way that covered something running very hot underneath. Someone walked up to the south side of that barn and started it deliberately. The kitchen was quiet. The fire in the stove moved against its grate. "Whitaker," Anna said, "there's no proof. There won't be proof. Men like Whitaker don't touch things directly." Matthew unclasped his hands and pressed them flat against the table. "But the timing, the day after the lumber deal, the day after I have a real path to clearing the note. He found out about the timber deal. Aldrich must have talked. Or his assistant. Small Valley's talk." His jaw tightened. "If the fire had taken the full winter supply, I would have had no choice. The cattle without hay through a Montana winter, we'd have lost half the herd. The banknote would have been impossible, and I'd have had to sell to survive. But it didn't take the full supply. No." His eyes moved to her briefly with an acknowledgement that didn't need words. "So where does that leave you?" Anna asked. "Still in the fight." He said it without pause, which told her something about where he was now compared to where he'd been 6 weeks ago when a bank letter could make the color leave his face. "But Whitaker knows I'm fighting, and that means he'll move again. And next time he won't give us a day's warning. Then we need to move first." He looked at her. "Not legally, not violently," she said immediately, reading his expression. "I mean information. If Whitaker is going to keep coming at this ranch, you need the valley to know why. You need people to see what he's doing, not just feel the effects of it without understanding the cause." "I'm not a man who makes public appeals," Matthew said. "I know that." Anna took her wrist from the water and wrapped the clean cloth he'd set beside the basin around it with practiced efficiency. "But you have relationships in this valley. Men who knew you when this ranch was strong. Ranchers who have their own reasons to be wary of Whitaker consolidating this corridor." She held his gaze. "You don't have to appeal to them. You just have to talk to them. Man to man, let them know what's happening, and you think that changes anything?" "I think Charles Whitaker is banking on your isolation," Anna said. "He's betting that you're alone in this and too proud to change that. If you talk to your neighbors, if you let the people in this valley see what's actually happening here, that this ranch is recovering, that the man running it is fully in the game again, you take away his most important assumption." Matthew was quiet for a long moment. "There's a valley meeting," he said. "First Friday of every month at the Willow Creek feed store. Ranchers, farmers, merchants. I haven't attended in over a year. Go this Friday." His eyes met hers. "Will you come?" The question surprised her. She could see it had surprised him too, a fractional shift in his expression that said the words had come out before he'd fully decided to say them. "If you want me to," she said carefully. "I'm asking." "Then yes." He looked at the cloth around her wrist. Then back at her face. "Get some," he said. "You first." Something that wasn't quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood crossed his face. He stood, pushed the basin aside, and walked to the door. "Anna," he stopped, didn't turn around. "What you said earlier. About the ranch giving you purpose." A pause. "I'm glad it did." "I'm glad you're here." He walked out before she could respond. She sat alone in the kitchen with the fire and the dark and the clean smell of cold water and wood smoke, and she pressed her wrapped wrist against the table and felt her own heartbeat in it, steady and certain, and thought about a man who was learning to say things out loud again after 2 years of silence. She thought that was one of the braver things she'd ever witnessed. The next 2 days moved fast and purposeful. Matthew rode to 2 neighboring ranches, the Caldwell spread to the north and the Reyes operation 3 miles east, and came back from each with the particular posture of a man who has been reminded that he is not as alone as he has been behaving. He didn't tell Anna everything that was said at those meetings, but he told her enough. Jim Caldwell had seen Whitaker's men on his fence line last month and hadn't known what to make of it. Rosa Reyes had been approached about selling water access and had declined but hadn't told anyone because she thought she was the only one. They were not the only ones. Whitaker was working the entire valley. He just happened to be working Walker Ranch hardest, because Walker Ranch was the most valuable and the most vulnerable. That was the twist that changed the shape of everything. Anna saw it the moment Matthew told her, sitting at the kitchen table on Thursday evening, with the ledger open between them and his face, carrying the expression of a man rearranging his understanding of his situation. "He's not after just your property," she said. "No. He's building a land corridor. He needs this ranch as the centerpiece, but he's been acquiring pieces around it for 2 years." Caldwell didn't know about the Reyes approach. Reyes didn't know about the pressure on my note. Matthew leaned back. "We've each been handling it alone, because he needed you to." Anna thought for a moment. If Caldwell and Reyes had known about each other, they'd have talked. If they'd talked, they'd have talked to you. 3 ranches coordinating is a very different problem for Whitaker than 3 ranches, each thinking they're isolated. Matthew's jaw set. "He's been deliberate about keeping us separate." "Very." She paused. "How many other ranches in this valley do you think have had some version of this conversation with Whitaker's people in the last 2 years? The silence that followed had a new quality to it. The kind that comes when a problem that looked personal becomes something larger. "I'll find out on Friday," Matthew said. The Willow Creek community meeting was held in a building large enough for 30 people to stand comfortably, which meant 50 people filled it past comfort, and the latecomers stood in the cold outside the open door. Anna had not anticipated the size of it or the attention. She felt it the moment they arrived, the slight but shift in the room, the heads turning, the quick assessments that small communities conduct through peripheral vision, and whispered exchanges. Matthew Walker had not been to a valley meeting in 14 months. Matthew Walker had arrived nobody recognized. These 2 facts were, in the social economy of Willow Creek, Montana, approximately equivalent to a lightning strike. She kept her expression settled and her posture straight and walked in beside him without apology for being present. A man named Gerald Burke, who ran the feed store and apparently served as the meeting's informal chair, crossed the room to shake Matthew's hand with the visible relief of someone who had been hoping for this for a while. "Matthew, good to see you on your feet and in the room." Burke's handshake was firm and genuine. "And you've brought Anna Bennett," Matthew said. "She manages the household operations at the ranch." Anna shook Burke's hand. She caught 3 distinct looks from people in the room, one dismissive, one curious, one from a woman about her age near the back wall that was simply direct and assessing, the look of someone calibrating accurately. That woman turned out to be Caroline Peterson, whose husband had sat at Anna's kitchen table 6 weeks ago and decided to stay. She found Anna during the first break in the meeting and extended her hand. "You're the reason Jacob's still at Walker Ranch," Caroline said. It wasn't a question. "Your husband made his own choice," Anna said. "He came home that evening and told me a woman had looked him in the eye and told him the ranch was worth staying for." Caroline paused. "I've been wanting to thank you since then." "He's good at his work," Anna said. "The ranch needs him. More importantly, he needed the ranch to need him." Caroline's eyes were direct and warm. "That matters more than the wage for a man like Jacob. He was becoming someone I didn't recognize. After that conversation with you, he came back." She pressed Anna's hand once and returned to her group. Anna turned back to the main conversation in the room, where Matthew had quietly begun talking to a rancher she didn't recognize older, with the careful economy of a man who'd survived long enough to know the cost of careless words. The conversation was low, focused, private in the way of 2 people comparing specific information. She watched Matthew's body language and saw at the moment the older rancher said something that confirmed what Matthew was beginning to understand about Whitaker's operation. The meeting itself was when everything shifted publicly. Matthew spoke for less than 10 minutes. Which was right. Men like him understood that credibility came from precision, not volume. He laid out what he knew: the purchased banknote, the fire, the isolated approaches to neighboring ranches, the pattern that only became visible when you put the pieces together. The room was very quiet while he spoke, then it was not quiet at all. Anna stood near the wall and watched it happen, the recognition moving through the room like something physical, person to person. The moment when a collection of individuals who have each been carrying a private pressure understand simultaneously that the pressure is shared and deliberate. The mood shifted from guarded to something harder-edged and resolute. Questions came fast. Burke had to raise his voice twice to maintain order. 2 other ranchers confirmed they'd been en route. A farmer on the valley's west end said Whitaker's man had come to his property 3 times in the past year. A woman whose family had held land near the northern ridge said she'd been offered money for water access she hadn't known she had the right to refuse. By the end of the meeting, Whitaker's strategy was visible to everyone in the room, and visible strategies lose most of their power. Riding back, Matthew was quiet in a way she'd learned to distinguish from his other silences. This was not withdrawal. This was processing the internal movement of a man integrating something significant. "You were right," he said, "about the isolation. He's been very careful about it. He won't have that advantage anymore." Matthew looked at the dark road ahead. Burke is going to organize the valley ranchers. Anyone Whitaker approaches now will know to say something. "And your banknote?" Caldwell offered to co-sign a delay application to the bank. "Reyes has a cousin who practices law in Helena." His voice carried something she hadn't heard much of before, the particular steadiness of a man who has remembered that he is not, in fact, alone. "It changes the mathematics." "Yes," she said, "it does." They rode in silence for a while. "Whitaker will know by tomorrow that the meeting happened," Matthew said. "He'll know I talked." "Yes, he'll move again, faster this time." "Angrier." "Probably. Are you worried?" Anna considered the question honestly, the way she considered most things. "I'm alert," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her sideways in the dark. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Stay that steady." "In every situation, the fire, the bank letter, Whitaker." "You don't?" He paused. "Choosing carefully, you don't lose your footing." "I lose it plenty," Anna said. "I just lose it privately." He was quiet for a moment. "What does it look like when you lose it privately?" The question was more personal than anything he'd asked her before. She felt its weight, the intimacy of being asked to be seen in the undone version of yourself, not the capable version. "Like a woman sitting on the edge of a cot at 10 o'clock at night," she said, trying to remember that things she's gotten through before don't kill her the second time either. Matthew didn't say anything to that, but his horse moved closer to hers on the road, just slightly, just enough that she could feel his presence at her left shoulder in the dark, close and steady. They rode back to the ranch like that. The attack came 3 days later, and it didn't come as fire. Perch arrived in the yard mid-morning with 2 men Anna hadn't seen before, and this time he didn't ask for Matthew. He asked for the woman managing the household, by name. Anna was in the kitchen when Hayes came to get her, and she read Hayes's expression carefully before she stepped outside. 3 of them, Hayes said quietly. Perch and 2 others. "The others don't look like working men." "What do they look like?" "Like men whose job isn't a job that gets named." Anna straightened her apron. "Where's Mr. Walker?" "North pasture with the men." "I can get him in 20 minutes, don't." Hayes looked at her. "Not yet," she said. "Let me talk to them first. Go to the barn and stay close, but don't come out unless I call." Hayes's expression said he disagreed with this plan. His expression also said he understood why she was making it, and that she was the kind of person whose reasoning he'd learned to extend some trust to even when he couldn't fully see where it was going. He went to the barn. Anna walked out to the yard. Perch looked at her with the particular attention of a man who has been sent to deliver a message and wants to make sure the recipient understands it fully. "Miss Bennett," he said, "Mr. Whitaker would like to make you aware of certain developments regarding Walker Ranch." "I'm sure he would," Anna said pleasantly. "The banknote is in default." "Technically. The 90-day window is not yet past its midpoint," Anna said. "I'm familiar with the timeline," Perch paused. He hadn't expected her to know the specifics. She watched him recalibrate. Mr. Whitaker is prepared to offer a clean exit, he said. For all parties, including yourself. A generous severance, written transition documentation, and a month's travel allowance. He's offering me money to leave, Anna said. He's offering a practical solution. He's trying to separate me from this ranch because he's realized I'm helping run it and he doesn't like the results. Anna kept her voice conversational. Calm, the kind of calm that is, in its own way, a statement. Tell Mr. Whitaker I appreciate the offer and decline. Perch's expression tightened fractionally. Miss Bennett, this ranch is going to change hands. The only question is when and what condition the people involved are in when it does. It would be in your personal interest. My personal interest, Anna said, is in this ranch succeeding. It's doing that, so we're not in alignment, Mr. Perch. I'm sorry for your trip. She turned to walk back to the kitchen. Miss Bennett. She stopped, did not turn. Mr. Whitaker is not a man who takes no for a final answer, Perch said. She turned around then, slowly, and looked at him directly. At him, and then at the two men flanking him, whose role Hayes had correctly identified as something that didn't get named out loud. Neither, she said, am I. She walked back inside. She stood at the kitchen window and watched them ride out, and her hands were shaking very slightly, not from fear, exactly, but from the particular physical response of a body that has been performing steadiness under pressure and is letting itself feel the cost of it now that the audience was gone. She made herself a cup of coffee. She was halfway through it when she heard boots crossing the yard at speed. Matthew came through the kitchen door with the expression of a man who has heard something at a distance that sent him back at a run, not. Hayes must have gotten to him faster than she'd told him to. Perch was here, Matthew said. Yes. Hayes said you talked to them alone. I handled it. Anna. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard before, not anger, but something adjacent to it, something that was really its own thing. Something that happened. Person you've been watching over realizes they've been in a situation you weren't present for. What did they say? She told him. His jaw tightened through the telling, and at the end of it he stood with his hands at his sides and his breathing controlled in that effortful way. He offered you money to leave, Matthew said. Yes. Because he's identified you as a factor in the ranch's recovery. That was my read. He's right. Matthew looked at her directly. You are a factor, the central one, a pause. Which means you are also now a target. I was a target the moment I arrived and started making things work, Anna said. That hasn't changed, just the directness of it. It changes what precautions need to be taken. He began pacing, which she'd never seen him do. It was a side of his thinking she hadn't witnessed, the physical expression of a mind moving fast through options. You shouldn't be alone in this kitchen at night. I've been alone in this kitchen every night since I arrived. Before Whitaker identified you as a threat to his plan, that was different. He stopped pacing. I want Hayes nearby at night, or he stopped again. Something crossed his face. He looked at her. I'll come myself. The kitchen was very quiet. Matthew, she said. It was the first time she'd used his given name without being invited to. She heard it happen in real time and did not walk it back. He heard it too. She could see it, the slight catch in his expression, the way the name from her mouth landed differently than anyone else saying it. He'd been Matthew to this valley his whole life. He'd been Mr. Walker to her for 6 weeks, and now he was Matthew again, in her voice, in this kitchen, in this particular moment where something that had been building with enormous patience was finally allowing itself to be named. You're not responsible for my safety, she said. I made my own choice to stay. I made my own choice to talk to Perch. I know you did. He took 2 steps toward her and stopped. And the 3 feet of distance between them felt like a different kind of space than it had felt like before the fire, before the timber deal, before he'd handed her his wife's ledger and told her what Elizabeth would have said about her. I know you're capable of taking care of yourself. That's not exhaled. That's not what this is about. Then what is it about, she asked, because she needed him to say it. Not for sentiment. Because she was a woman who had learned to operate on honest ground, and this conversation required it. Matthew Walker looked at her. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the ash-drifted yard after the fire, across 3 feet of charged and particular distance, and this time he didn't look away. "I don't want anything to happen to you," he said. Simply, without shelter. "I have not wanted something that directly in 2 years." A pause. "That's what it's about." The fire in the stove settled. Outside, a horse called from the barn, and another answered. Anna looked at this man, this difficult, damaged, recovering, capable, honest man, and felt something she'd been keeping carefully in its proper compartment for 6 weeks shift in a way that told her the compartment had outlived its usefulness. "Nothing is going to happen to me," she said. "You don't know that." "No," she held his gaze, "but I know that I'm not going to leave. And I know that this ranch is going to be all right. And I know that you are going to be all right." She paused. "Those things I do know." He looked at her for a long moment. "How?" he asked. The same question he'd asked her weeks ago about Peterson. Still asking it, still needing her version of the answer. "Because I'm watching you," she said, "the same way you watched me in that garden in the first week and saw something worth paying attention to. I'm watching you, Matthew, and what I see is a man who came back." His jaw worked once. He reached across the small distance between them and took her hand, the one with the wrapped wrist, the burned one, and held it carefully. With the particular gentleness of a man who handles things that matter to him, with more care than he handles anything else. He held it for a moment, then he set it down. "I'm going to write to the bank tonight," he said, his voice slightly different than before. Still controlled, but something in it had opened, the application for the delay. With Caldwell's co-signature and Reyes's cousin's legal letter. "Good, and I'm going to respond to Whitaker directly. By name, in writing, making it clear that this ranch is not for sale and that the valley is aware of his methods. Better. And I'm going to ride the full property tomorrow morning, with Hayes, and document every section of fencing, every water source, every structure. Full inventory, so that if Whitaker's people come back for a different kind of visit, we have a clear baseline." "That's exactly right," Anna said. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the table when he came in. He put it on. He stood at the kitchen door for a moment. "Will you still be here in the morning?" he asked. She understood the real question beneath the practical one. "I'll be here," she said. "I have bread to start before 5, and the pantry shelves need reorganizing, and there are 3 hens producing less than they should, and I need to figure out why." The ghost of something that had once been a smile that she'd been catching more and more often, building back like everything else on this ranch, crossed his face. "Good," he said. He walked out into the night. Anna stood alone in her kitchen, in the kitchen that nobody had wanted, that she had rebuilt from rust and neglect and the particular stubbornness of someone who could see what a thing was capable of underneath what it had become. And she put her unwrapped wrist against the warm iron of the stove and felt the heat come through. Solid, real, reliable, built to last. Somewhere across the yard she heard Matthew Walker's boots on the porch of the main house. Heard his door open and close. Heard, a few minutes later, the sound of a lamp coming on in the window she could just make out from hers. He was at his desk. He was writing the letter. She turned back to her work. Tomorrow was going to require everything they had. She intended to be ready for it. The letter to the bank went out with the morning rider, and Anna heard Matthew in the main house, past midnight, the sound of the lamp still burning, the occasional scrape of a chair. The quiet evidence of a man doing the work he'd been putting off for 2 years, all in one determined night. She didn't sleep well, either. Not from worry. From the particular alertness of someone who knows the next few days will require everything and wants to be ready when they arrive. Morning came hard and cold, the kind of cold that meant business, and she was at the stove by 4:30 with the fire going, and the bread started before she heard Matthew Boots cross the yard toward the barn. He was riding the property early. Good. She'd told him to, and he'd remembered, and that small evidence of their coordinated thinking settled something in her chest the way it always did, quietly, without ceremony, the way real things settle. Hayes appeared at 6, with the expression he wore when he was carrying news he hadn't decided how to arrange yet. 2 things, he said, sitting down at her work table. She poured coffee and waited. First, The bank in Billings has a new manager. Man named Foss, who came in from the Eastern office 8 months ago. I found this out last night from Burke, who found it out from his cousin who does accounts for the Billings Merchant Association. Hayes wrapped both hands around the cup. Foss is the one who accelerated the note, and Foss has a history. 3 ranches in the Eastern Territory called their notes in the past 2 years under his management. All 3 ended up in the hands of the same buyer. Anna looked at him. Whitaker. Hayes's voice was flat. Foss isn't just a bank manager doing his job, he's part of it. He's Whitaker's instrument inside the bank. The shape of it opened fully in Anna's mind, the whole structure of it, how deliberate and patient and far-reaching it actually was. Not one man making opportunistic offers on a struggling ranch. A coordinated operation that included banking corruption, deliberate isolation of targets, arson when necessary, and the kind of patient accumulation that only works when every piece is positioned correctly. Matthew needs to know this before he talks to anyone else, Anna said. I'm telling you first why. Hayes looked at her directly. Because you think faster in a crisis, and because what I'm about to tell you next is going to land harder. She waited. Perch was seen this morning, Hayes said. Before light. Outside Peterson's house in town. The cold came through the kitchen wall the way it always did in the hour before full morning, but she felt it differently this time. He's going after the men's families now, she said. That's my read. Did Peterson see him? Peterson's wife did. Caroline came out to get water and found Perch standing on the other side of the fence looking at the house. Hayes set down his cup. She didn't panic. She went back inside, locked the door, and sent her oldest boy to get Peterson. By the time Peterson got outside, Perch was gone. He paused. But the message was sent. Anna stood up. Get Matthew, she said. Now, don't wait for him to finish the property ride. Get him back here. Hayes was already at the door. She used the 20 minutes before Matthew arrived to think. Not to worrying consumed the same energy that thinking required and produced nothing useful, but to actually think. Moving the pieces of the situation across her mind the way she moved supplies across the kitchen inventory. Looking for what was there, what was missing, and what could be done with what was available. By the time Matthew came through the kitchen door, still in his riding coat with Hayes 2 steps behind him, she had something close to a plan. Foss, Matthew said. He'd already heard it from Hayes on the way back. His voice was controlled in that effortful way. I've met him. Twice. He seemed reasonable. He's not reasonable, Anna said. He's Whitaker's man inside the institution that holds your debt. Which means the standard approach to the bank delay letters, legal documentation, co-signatures may not reach the right hands. Then what does reach the right hands? Someone above Foss, she said. Who is his supervisor? Matthew thought. The regional banking office in Helena. A man named Cartwright. I've never dealt with him directly. Does Reyes's cousin in Helena, the lawyer, does he have connections to the regional banking office? Matthew looked at Hayes. Hayes said, I can find out inside the hour. Find out, Anna looked at Matthew. If Cartwright can be reached directly, not through Foss, not through the branch, but directly. With documented evidence of Foss's pattern across those 3 Eastern Territory ranches, and the timing of his note of acceleration relative to Whitaker's subsequent purchases. We're not just defending the ranch, Matthew said, following it to where it went. We're making a case of corruption. Whitaker has been operating on the assumption that each person he targets is alone and looking straight down at their own situation, Anna said. He's never had someone stand back far enough to see the whole pattern and name it out loud. She held Matthew's gaze. That changes what he is, legally, publicly, in this valley and beyond it. Matthew was very still. You're talking about going at him directly, he said. I'm talking about telling the truth clearly enough and loudly enough that the truth does the work. Anna paused. That's all, but it has to be done right, with documentation. With other voices beside yours. And it has to be done before he makes his next move. Because his next move is going to be against the men's families, which means it's going to be against people who didn't sign up for any of this, and who deserve to be protected. Matthew looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to Hayes. Ride to the Reyes place, today. Tell Rosa what we know about Foss and what we need from her cousin. Tell her it's urgent, and that I'll owe her a debt of my own choosing." Hayes left at a run. Matthew turned back to Anna. Something in his bearing had shifted again, the same shift she'd watched happen at the fire, when the crisis burned away everything non-essential and left only the most functional version of him standing in the yard. Except this time it wasn't emergency producing it. It was decision, clean, voluntary, fully inhabited decision. "I need to talk to the men," he said, "all of them. Today, yes, and I need to get word to Peterson. Caroline needs to know that what she saw this morning isn't going to be repeated." "I'll go to town myself," Anna said, "this afternoon. I'll see Caroline directly." He looked at her. "You said nothing is going to happen to you," he said. "And I meant it. I'll take Eli. His leg is well enough to ride, and he's protection, without looking like protection." A pause. "And I know how to take care of myself, Matthew." He looked at her with that particular expression, the one that was really a dozen things at once. Every one of them complicated by the fact that he was a man who had already lost someone and was currently standing in front of someone he could not afford to lose and knew it. "All right," he said. He put his hat on. "When this is over," he said at the door. She waited. "When this is over, I'd like to sit down with you and have a conversation that has nothing to do with ledgers or banknotes or Charles Whitaker." Her chest did something she didn't try to analyze. "I'd like that," she said. He left. She finished the bread, packed what she needed, and went to find Eli. Caroline Peterson answered the door before Anna knocked, which told her Caroline had been watching the road. She was a small woman, precise in her movements, with the look of someone who had been managing fear all morning. Through the productive application of activity, the house was clearly in a state of having been cleaned at great speed. She saw Anna and exhaled. "Come in," she said. "I can't stay long," Anna said. "But I wanted you to hear it directly rather than through Jacob." She sat at Caroline's table and said plainly what was happening, what they knew, what they were doing, and why the man outside her fence line this morning would not be coming back. Caroline listened without interrupting. When Anna finished, Caroline was quiet for a moment. "You're sure?" she asked. "We're moving fast, and we're moving together," Anna said. "That's all the certainty I can give you, but yes, I'm sure." Caroline looked at her hands. "Jacob came back from that conversation with you 6 weeks ago like a different person," she said. "He came home and he sat at that table, and he said someone had reminded him that his work mattered, that the place was worth his best." She looked up. "I hadn't seen him like that in over a year." "He's good at what he does," Anna said. "So are you," Caroline said, "from everything Jacob tells me." She paused. "Is it a careful pause? Is it just the ranch you're staying for?" Anna looked at her. Caroline held her gaze with the direct, unashamed curiosity of a woman who has been married long enough to recognize the signs of something significant beginning in another person. "Ask me that question in the spring," Anna said. Caroline smiled, a real one, warm and knowing. "I will." The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Eli kept his horse 2 lengths behind her, out of some instinct toward discretion that she appreciated. The valley was going gray and cold in the early afternoon, the sky low and the wind coming down off the mountains with a particular edge of late November in Montana, carrying the smell of what was coming. She was thinking about Matthew when she saw the rider. A single man on a fast horse, coming from the direction of the ranch, moving with the urgency that made her pull up before she'd consciously decided to. Eli came up beside her. "That's Davies," Eli said. Davies reached them in 2 minutes, and his horse was breathing hard. "Whitaker's in the yard," he said, without preamble. Rode in himself, not Perch, him. Anna felt the cold move through her in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Whitaker himself. Men like Whitaker did not appear in person unless they had decided to end something. "Mr. Walker," she asked, "in the yard with him. Hayes is there." 2 of Whitaker's men standing back. Davies looked at her directly. "Walker sent me to find you," he said. Davies paused, as if deciding whether to repeat it exactly. "He decided to. He said he wanted you there." She turned her horse. "Let's go," she said. Charles Whitaker was not what she'd built in her imagination. She'd constructed something more villainous, heavier, coarser. The man standing in Walker Ranch's yard was well dressed, perhaps 55. with a clean-shaved face, and the careful grooming of someone who understood that appearance was a statement of power. He was not large. He was precise. The kind of man who was most dangerous not when he was angry but when he was calm, because his calm was the calm of someone who believed he had already won, and was simply waiting for the other party to understand it. He looked at her when she rode in and dismounted, and she saw him register her not as a woman, not as a curiosity, but as a variable. Something he was calculating in real time. Matthew was standing 10 feet from Whitaker, with the posture she'd come to read as his fully arrived self straight, still, present, radiating nothing unnecessarily. His eyes found her when she came through the yard gate, and something in them settled. Not relief. Something quieter than relief. The particular easing of a man who knows where all the important things are. "Miss Bennett," Whitaker said, "I believe my associate spoke with you recently." "He did," Anna said pleasantly. "I declined his offer, as I'm sure he reported." "He did." Whitaker turned back to Matthew. "I've come to be direct, Walker." "I prefer directness, then be direct," Matthew said. "The banknote is called. You have approximately 60 days remaining, by my calculation. The lumber deal you've arranged will help, but it won't be enough on its current timeline." Whitaker's voice was smooth. "Professional. I've increased my offer for this property. I'm prepared to pay fairly, clear your remaining debts, and provide you and your employees a transition that leaves everyone intact. And if I say no, then I wait 60 days and purchase the debt's collateral for significantly less." Whitaker paused. "It's mathematics, Walker. I'm offering you a dignified outcome because I respect what this property was and because I have no interest in unnecessary hardship." "That's very generous," Matthew said, "from the man who had my banknote purchased by a corrupt manager, had my winter hay storage set on fire, and sent his man to stand outside a ranch hand's family home before sunrise." The yard was very still. Whitaker's smooth expression did not break. But something behind it recalculated. Those are serious accusations. "They're documented facts." Matthew's voice was level. "The banking irregularities across 3 Eastern Territory properties, including mine, have been referred to the Regional Banking Authority in Helena. By name Foss's name, and yours as the subsequent purchaser in each case." He paused. "That documentation is already in Helena. It went out this morning." It hadn't gone this morning. It had gone an hour ago, after Hayes returned from the Reyes Ranch, with confirmation that Rosa's cousin had both the connections and the fierce professional appetite for exactly this kind of case. But Whitaker didn't know the exact timing, and Matthew Walker's voice gave him no reason to doubt a word of it. Whitaker looked at him, then he looked at Anna. She watched him make the calculation, the same calculation he'd been making, since Perch first reported back on her, the assessment of what she was and what she represented to this ranch and to the man standing beside it. She held his gaze with everything she had, which was considerable. "This is a mistake," Whitaker said. "Walking away is the only option available to you right now," Matthew said. "The Valley knows what you've been doing. The bank authority will know within the week. Every rancher between here and the northern ridge knows your methods." His voice didn't rise. "You bought a debt on a struggling ranch and you've spent 2 months trying to make it fall. It didn't fall, and now you're standing in its yard." Something moved through Whitaker's expression, not quite rage, too controlled for that, but the hard, cold anger of a man who has been outmaneuvered and knows it and cannot immediately find the path back. He looked at the ranch, at the repaired buildings, the smoke rising from the kitchen chimney, the men standing at their positions around the yard, with the particular quality of people who are on their ground and know it. He looked at Matthew. He put on his hat. "We'll see how the next 60 days go," he said. He walked to his horse. His 2 men followed. He rode out. The yard held its silence for a full 10 seconds after the gate closed. Then Eli, from somewhere behind Anna, said in his reliable way of saying things that needed saying, "Did we just win?" Hayes looked at the gate. "We held," he said. "Winning comes later." Matthew turned and looked at Anna. She looked at him. "Helena?" she asked quietly. "Went out by fast rider an hour ago," he said. Hayes made it back from the Reyes place in time. "Rosa's cousin, his name is Delgado," he said. "This is exactly the kind of case he's been looking to bring." Matthew paused. He sounded angry on behalf of the law. Hayes said it was something to see. Good, Anna said. 60 days, Matthew. It's still 60 days, it is, she held his gaze. And we have a timber deal, a legal case building in Helena, a valley full of ranchers who now know exactly what they're dealing with, and a kitchen that can feed every man on this property through a Montana winter. She paused. I've worked with less. Something broke across his face then, not the ghost of a smile, not the careful controlled version she'd been collecting for 2 months. Something real and full, briefly unmanaged, the expression of a man who has been reminded that he is alive, and that it is a good thing to be. It lasted only a moment, but she saw it. She carried it with her for the rest of the day. The 60 days did not pass easily. Nothing about the recovery of Walker Ranch passed easily, and Anna would not have trusted it if it had. Easy recoveries were surface recoveries. They looked fine and cracked at the first pressure. What they were building was something different, and she knew it because she could feel the weight of it in every day, every problem solved, every small decision accumulated into something larger. Whitaker made 2 more moves. The first was a legal challenge to the timber rights, a claim filed in Billings, that the North Ridge boundary was in dispute, which was technically possible and actually baseless, and which Delgado disposed of in 11 days with documentation that made the challenge look not just wrong, but deliberately manufactured. That documentation, when it reached the Regional Banking Authority's desk, alongside the pattern evidence on Foss, produced consequences that moved faster than anyone expected. Foss was suspended from his position at the bank, pending investigation on the 22nd day. The second move was a rumor, the particular kind that travels through small communities with the speed and damage of something that feels true even when it isn't. That Anna Bennett was not who she claimed to be. That she had come from a failed farm in Kansas with debts she hadn't disclosed and a history that didn't bear examination. That Matthew Walker was being managed by a woman who had her own agenda and wasn't what she appeared. The rumor reached the ranch on a Wednesday through Eli, who had heard it in town and came back furious, which was the most visible Anna had ever seen him. He told her in the kitchen, his jaw tight and his freckled face carrying the expression of someone who has heard something said about a person they respect and is still vibrating from it. I know what's being said, Anna told him calmly. It's a lie, Eli said. Yes, we should keep working, Anna said. Every day we function well is a refutation. You can't argue a lie effectively with words. You argue it with evidence. She looked at him. Has anyone on this ranch looked at me differently since they heard it? Eli paused, thought no, then there's your answer. Matthew heard the rumor from Burke, who rode out personally to tell him, and to say in the same breath that nobody at the community meeting believed it, and that 3 Valley wives had already conducted their own informal campaign of correction. That was, Burke reported with evident respect, considerably more effective than anything the men would have managed. Caroline Peterson's name was mentioned prominently. Matthew came to the kitchen that evening and told her what Burke had said, and Anna listened without interrupting, and when he finished she said, "It's the last thing he had available." Matthew looked at her. "How do you know it's the last thing?" "Because it's the smallest thing," she said. "Men like Whitaker go bigger before they go smaller." The fire was big, the banking corruption was big, the intimidation was mid-sized. A rumor is small. She paused. You throw small things when you're running out of large ones. He was quiet for a moment. "It bothers me," he said. "I know, not because I believe it." His voice was careful, deliberate. "Because someone is trying to diminish what you've done here. What you are here." He looked at her with the directness that had become over these months, one of the things she most valued about him, the way he looked at what was true and said it without dressing it. "You rebuilt this ranch, Anna. I need you to know that I know that." "We rebuilt it," she said. "No, steady. You rebuilt me first." The ranch followed. The silence that came after that was the softest one they'd ever shared. She didn't look away from him. He didn't look away from her. Outside, the wind had dropped, the way it dropped sometimes in late November in Montana, suddenly, completely, as if the whole valley had decided to hold its breath. "That conversation," he said, "the one with nothing to do with ledgers or banknotes." "Yes," she said, "I'd like to have it now, if you're willing." She was willing. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd first read his ledger, where Peterson had eaten eggs and decided to stay, where Hayes had drunk coffee and told her the truth about a ranch that kept running out of habit, and they talked for 3 hours. Not about the ranch, about Kansas, about Elizabeth. About the particular way loss reshapes a person and what it means to rebuild something in yourself the way you rebuild anything, with patience, with honesty, with the willingness to look at what's actually there instead of what you wish was there. He told her about Elizabeth in a way he hadn't told her before, not with careful, guarded references, but with the full weight of someone speaking plainly about a person they loved and lost. She listened with everything she had, because that was what was required, and because she understood that this was him trusting her with the most important room in himself, the one he'd kept locked for 2 years. She told him about Kansas, about the farm, about the morning she stood in the field and made herself stand up straight and choose forward, about what that cost and what it built. He listened the same way she did. At midnight the fire in the stove burned low, and neither of them moved to bank it higher, and the kitchen was warm enough. "I have something I want to ask you," Matthew said. She waited. "I've been thinking about how to say it properly," he said. "I haven't arrived at properly, so I'm going to say it plainly instead. Because plain has served us better than proper from the beginning." "Plain is fine," she said. He looked at her across the table. With that look, the full, direct, unhidden version of it, the one she'd been collecting in small doses for months, and that she now received in its entirety. "I want you to stay," he said, "not in the kitchen. Not in the position, not as the person who manages the household." He paused. "I want you to stay as the person who drinks coffee with me at midnight and argues with me about the ledger and tells me the truth when I'm about to make a mistake." Another pause. "As the person whose opinion I trust entirely, whose presence has made this ranch into something I recognize again, and whose absence I am unwilling to imagine." He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. Carefully, with the full deliberate intention of someone who has thought about this gesture and means every part of it. "Anna Bennett," he said, "I am asking you to marry me. Plainly and without reservation, and knowing you well enough to know that you will give me an honest answer, and that I can trust it." The kitchen was very quiet. She looked at his hand over hers. She looked at his face. She thought about a woman who had arrived at this ranch with one bag and a position that barely existed, who had walked into a ruined kitchen and seen not what it was, but what it could be. She thought about the stove she'd brought back from rust, the garden she'd coaxed from neglect, the men she'd fed, the ledger she'd kept, the fire she'd stood beside with a rope in her hands and refused to move back from. She thought about the man across this table, and the 2 years of grief he'd walked through to arrive at this moment, and the courage it took to go here and mean it. "Yes," she said, "just that." One word, plain and complete and carrying everything it needed to carry. His hand tightened over hers. He exhaled a long, slow release, the sound of a man who has been holding something carefully for a very long time and has just been told he can set it down. They sat like that for a while. The fire settled in the stove. The kitchen held them the way it had held everything that mattered since she arrived, simply, solidly, without ceremony, the way good foundations hold. The banknote was cleared on the 58th day. The timber proceeds came in on the 41st, and the spring cattle drive, which Matthew ran with full presence, riding every mile, negotiating in billings with the assurance of a man who knows his herd's worth and will not accept less brought in revenue that exceeded the previous 2 seasons combined. The final payment to the bank arrived with 2 days to spare, and Matthew Walker sat at his desk in the main house and looked at the receipt for a long time before he folded it and put it in the drawer that held the other important documents of his life. Foss was formally removed from his position in Helena in early spring, and the case Delgado built against Whitaker's banking practices reached the territorial court before the snow melted from the North Ridge. Whitaker did not go to prison. Men like Whitaker rarely did, but the legal proceedings consumed enough of his attention and sources that his acquisition operation in the valley quietly dissolved. The ranches he'd purchased were resold. The corridor he'd been building never completed. The valley went back to itself, Walker Ranch did not go back to what it had been. It became something better. The wedding was held in April, on a morning when the last of the winter was visibly retreating, and the garden behind the old kitchen was already showing green at the soil line. Anna had planted winter garlic in November, in the first hard week when she'd barely known the names of the men she was feeding, and it had been the first thing to come back. Hayes stood beside Matthew. Caroline Peterson stood beside Anna, which was not a formal plan, but simply what happened. Because Caroline had shown up the morning of with a pressed dress and a look that said she intended to be useful and was not going to be argued with. Eli cried. He denied it immediately and comprehensively, and to everyone present, but the evidence was there and nobody was gracious enough to pretend otherwise. Burke married them, having held that informal community authority long enough that the Valley had collectively decided it was official. Afterward, Matthew and Anna stood outside the kitchen, outside the building that had started it. The forgotten kitchen that she had found and reclaimed and made into the heart of the property. And she looked at the smoke rising from its chimney into the clean spring air. "We should build it larger," Matthew said beside her. "Properly. Stone foundation, new roof. If it's going to be the center of this ranch, it should be built to last." Anna thought about the first day, about the cracked windows and the rusted stove and the bucket catching rainwater on the floor, about the look Matthew had expected on her face when he showed it to her, and the look she'd given him instead. "It's already built to last," she said. "We just had to remember that." He took her hand. She took his. And in that spring morning, in Montana, in that particular year, and on that particular, that had refused to give up even when everyone who should have been holding it had stopped believing, not. Walker Ranch stood complete. Not because it had been rescued. Not because someone had arrived with enough money or enough power or enough certainty to simply make everything right. But because two people had looked at what was broken and chosen, every single day, to do the next necessary thing. And because the next necessary thing, repeated with patience and honesty, and the stubborn refusal to look away, had turned out to be enough. More than enough, it had turned out to be everything.